I knew the HOA president, Karren Whitmore, had it out for me, but I never expected her to go this far. I had just pulled into my driveway after a long shift when I saw at my front gate, chained and padlocked shut with a thick, rusted chain. At first I thought I was hallucinating from exhaustion, but no. There it was, gleaming under my porch light, a smug little note taped to the gate. Non-compliance with HOA regulations. Property access restricted until fines are paid in full. I clenched my jaw. This was beyond her usual petty nonsense. My house wasn't even part of the HOA. I bought it years before the association was formed, and I had refused to join when they tried to annex my property. That hadn't stopped Karren from trying to force her authority on me at every turn, fines for non-existent violations, threats of legal action, and now, this. I yanked at the chain, but it was industrial grade. She had gone out of her way to ensure I couldn't even get into my own home. That was the last straw. I took out my phone and snapped pictures from every angle, close-ups of the chain, the padlock, the ridiculous note with her signature at the bottom. Then I walked around to my backyard, climbed over my fence, and got inside through the back door. If Karren thought she could trap me out of my own house, she was dead wrong. The next morning, I took my evidence straight to the courthouse. I wasn't just going to have the chain removed, I was going to make sure Karren regretted ever pulling this stunt. Walking into the courthouse, I felt a cold determination settle over me. This wasn't just about getting the chain removed, it was about making sure Karren never pulled a stunt like this again. I headed straight for the clerk's office, presented my evidence, and requested an emergency hearing. The clerk barely looked surprised when I mentioned Karren's name. Apparently, I wasn't the first person to complain about her antics. The judge granted my request, and within hours, I found myself standing before him, laying out exactly what had happened. I showed the pictures, explained how I had never been part of the HOA, and pointed out how Karren had illegally restricted access to my property. The judge's eyebrows furrowed as he examined the evidence. When I finished speaking, he leaned back in his chair, clearly unimpressed with Karren's behavior. Legal proceedings moved faster than I expected. The judge ordered an immediate injunction requiring Karren to remove the chain or face contempt charges, but I wasn't done yet. I had already filed a separate civil suit for damages, arguing that her actions had caused undue hardship and violated my property rights. I made sure she wouldn't just get a slap on the wrist, she was going to feel this where it hurt the most. With the court order in hand, I drove straight back to my house. Sure enough, Karren was standing outside with a group of her usual HOA cronies, looking smug. She must have thought I had given up. That expression vanished the moment I stepped out of my car and handed her the official court order. Her face twisted in disbelief as she read it, her hand tightening around the paper. She tried to argue, claiming the HOA had every right to enforce its rules. I pointed out, calmly and clearly, that my property was never under HOA jurisdiction. When she continued to sputter excuses, I simply took out my phone and started dialing the non-emergency police line. The threat of law enforcement arriving on her doorstep was enough to make her cave. She barked orders at one of her lackeys, who rushed off to fetch bolt cutters. Within minutes, the chain was gone, but I wasn't finished with her, yet not by a long shot. The next day, I followed through on the civil lawsuit. I filed for damages related to illegal trespassing, interference with property rights, and emotional distress. I also took things a step further. I filed a restraining order against Karren, citing her repeated harassment and now outright illegal actions. When she was served with the legal papers, I heard from a neighbor that she had nearly lost her mind in rage. Karren tried to fight it, of course. She hired a lawyer, but the facts weren't on her side. The evidence was overwhelming, and the judge saw right through her attempts to justify her behavior. The restraining order was granted, barring her from coming within 100 feet of my property. But the real blow came when she realized what the civil suit meant. Because she had acted in her personal capacity and not as an official representative of the HOA, she was personally liable for damages. That meant she couldn't push the legal fees onto the HOA's funds she had to pay out of her own pocket. And when the judgment came down in my favor, it wasn't a small amount. The court awarded me enough to cover legal costs, damages, and a hefty penalty for her blatant disregard of property laws. When she refused to pay, I took the next step. I petitioned the court to seize her personal assets to satisfy the judgment. It wasn't long before a lien was placed on her home, and her bank accounts were frozen until she paid what she owed. The fallout was glorious. The HOA board, realizing how much of a liability Karren had become, held an emergency meeting. With mounting legal fees and public embarrassment, they had no choice but to remove her from her position. The final insult came when Karren, now drowning in financial trouble, was forced to put her house up for sale. The neighborhood was finally free from her tyranny, and I made sure to let everyone know exactly what had happened. The new HOA leadership quickly backed off from trying to annex my property, and the community finally started to breathe easier. As for Karren, she disappeared from the neighborhood shortly after selling her home, her reputation in ruins. I never saw her again, and frankly, I didn't care where she went. What mattered was that justice had been served, and I had made sure she paid the price for trying to control something that was never hers to begin with. With Karren out of the picture, the neighborhood settled into a strange calm. People who had once tiptoed around her now held their heads high, relieved that her reign was over. The HOA, desperate to distance itself from the disaster she had caused, sent out a newsletter announcing a new, more resident-friendly leadership. It was all damage control, of course, but I didn't care as long as they left me alone. For the first time in years, I could enjoy my home without the constant worry of a fabricated violation landing on my doorstep. But even though Karren was gone, I wasn't about to let my guard down. I had learned the hard way that people like her always left a mess behind. Sure enough, that mess arrived in the form of an envelope taped to my door. It was from the new HOA president, a man named Richard Calloway. Unlike Karren, Richard had a reputation for being more diplomatic, but I wasn't about to take him at his word. Inside the envelope was a letter, politely requesting a friendly discussion about the status of my property. I sighed. They still hadn't learned. Instead of responding, I went straight to my attorney, a no-nonsense woman named Lisa Hawthorne. She had handled my case against Karren with brutal efficiency, and I trusted her to see through whatever angle the HOA was playing now. She skimmed the letter, her expression unreadable, then looked up at me. "They're testing the waters," she said. "They want to see how much trouble you're willing to go through before they make their next move." I leaned back in the chair, already feeling the familiar irritation creeping in. "They can keep testing. My answer isn't changing," Lisa nodded. "Then we'll make sure they understand that in legal terms." She drafted a response that left no room for misinterpretation. My property was not under HOA jurisdiction, and any further attempts to interfere would be met with legal action. I signed it without hesitation, and Lisa sent it off immediately. A few days later, Richard himself showed up at my door. Unlike Karren, who had always carried herself with an air of self-importance, Richard had the look of a man who had inherited a disaster and was trying to salvage what he could. He stood on my porch, hands clasped in front of him, waiting for me to acknowledge his presence. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. "You got my lawyer's letter, I assume?" he nodded, shifting on his feet. "I did, and I want to assure you I have no intention of causing trouble." "Then why are you here?" Richard exhaled, clearly choosing his words carefully. "The HOA is trying to move forward. Karren left behind a lot of issues and we're cleaning up the damage. We want to avoid any more legal conflicts." I crossed my arms. "That's up to you, isn't it?" He hesitated, then pulled out a folder. "I just want to make sure there are no lingering disputes. The board is reviewing past records and we found some questionable documents regarding your property. I'd like to clear them up." I took the folder but didn't open it. "Questionable how?" Richard frowned. There were attempts to annex your property into the HOA. Some of the paperwork was, frankly, suspicious. I want to make sure nothing comes back to bite you or us down the line. That got my attention. If Karren had been attempting to pull something shady beyond what I already knew, I needed to find out. I flipped through the documents, my stomach tightening as I saw what she had done. She had forged signatures. One of the documents claimed I had agreed to join the HOA years ago, complete with a signature that vaguely resembled mine but was clearly faked. It was dated long before the first dispute I had with Karren, meaning she had been planning this for far longer than I had realized. I clenched the folder. "And what does your board plan to do about this?" Richard held up his hands. "I want to get ahead of this before it turns into another legal battle. We're willing to invalidate all of these documents, officially recognize your property as separate, and put it in writing so no future board tries anything similar." It was an unexpected offer, but I wasn't about to trust it blindly. "I want everything reviewed by my lawyer before I sign anything." "Of course," Richard agreed. "We're not looking for another fight, just trying to fix what can be fixed." I studied him for a long moment, trying to determine if he was just another version of Karren in disguise, but he looked weary, not scheming. Maybe he really was trying to clean up the mess she had left behind. "Fine," I said. "Send everything through my lawyer and I'll consider it." Richard nodded, relief evident on his face. "Thank you, and for what it's worth, I'm sorry you had to deal with all of this." I didn't bother responding as I shut the door. Apologies wouldn't undo what had happened, but at least now, I had something concrete to ensure Karren's nonsense wouldn't haunt me in the future. Later that evening, Lisa called after reviewing the documents. "She really thought she could get away with this," Lisa muttered, disgust evident in her voice. "These forgeries are sloppy, but they could have caused serious problems if Richard hadn't brought them to us." "Can we do anything about it legally?" Lisa hesitated. "Technically, yes. Forgery is a serious offense, but with Karren gone and already paying off the lawsuit, it might not be worth the hassle of tracking her down. However, I can draft an official agreement with the HOA that permanently bars them from trying anything like this again." "Do it," I said without hesitation. Within a week, the new HOA leadership signed the agreement, legally binding them to never attempt to annex my property in the future. Lisa ensured the wording was airtight, preventing any loopholes. With that final document, it was over. Karren had tried to control every aspect of this neighborhood, believing she was untouchable. But in the end, her greed had been her downfall. She had lost everything: her position, her home, and whatever shred of authority she had once wielded. And I was finally free. As I sat on my porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. No more harassment, no more ridiculous fines, no more chains on my gate, just peace. And I intended to enjoy every second of it. With Karren out of the picture and the HOA legally bound to leave me alone, I thought I could finally relax. But if there was one thing I had learned from this whole ordeal, it was that people like Karren never disappeared without leaving a mess behind. It started subtly. A few odd glances from neighbors who had once been on her side, whispered conversations that stopped as soon as I walked by. I didn't think much of it at first, just remnants of Karren's influence dissolving. But then, little annoyances began piling up. My mailbox was mysteriously knocked over one morning, my trash cans were tipped over and scattered across my lawn, and once, someone left an anonymous note taped to my door, accusing me of ruining the neighborhood. I wasn't about to let Karren's lingering supporters intimidate me. If they wanted to play games, they were going to realize real fast that I wasn't the type to back down. I installed more security cameras around my property front yard, backyard, driveway, even a discreet one near the mailbox. If someone wanted to mess with me, they were going to get caught in crystal clear footage. Sure enough, 2 nights later, my cameras caught a pair of familiar figures skulking around my property. One was Jeff, Karren's most loyal supporter on the HOA board before she was ousted. The other was Linda, one of the more vocal residents who had backed Karren's nonsense from the start. The footage showed them deliberately knocking over my trash cans and kicking at my fence before scurrying away like guilty teenagers. The next morning, I took the footage straight to the new HOA leadership. Richard, to his credit, looked genuinely frustrated when I showed him the video. He assured me he'd handle it, but I wasn't about to rely on an HOA to fix my problems. I went straight to the police station and filed a report for trespassing and vandalism. The officers took it seriously, especially with the clear video evidence I provided. Within days, Jeff and Linda were both visited by officers and given stern warnings about stepping foot on my property again. That should have been the end of it, but instead it escalated. A week later, I woke up to find a bright red violation notice taped to my front door. HOA letterhead, official-looking language, the works. The claim that my property was in violation of community aesthetic standards due to excessive debris and unsightly conditions. I stared at the notice, barely able to believe the audacity. My lawn was immaculate, my house well-maintained, and my trash bins were properly stored. This was nothing but a desperate attempt at retaliation. I marched straight over to the HOA office, where Richard and a few board members were wrapping up a meeting. I held up the notice, letting them get a good look at it before I dropped it onto the table in front of them. Richard looked over the paper and sighed. His frustration was evident, but I wasn't interested in sympathy. I wanted solutions. He assured me the notice had not been issued by the board, which meant someone had gone rogue. A quick review of their records confirmed that no such violation had been officially recorded. Someone had falsified the notice, likely hoping I'd be intimidated into compliance. I wasn't. Instead, I did what I did best: I gathered evidence. I checked my security footage again, and sure enough, late the previous night, Linda had been caught on camera taping the notice to my door. Armed with that proof, I went straight back to the police. This time, the officers didn't just give a warning. Linda was slapped with charges for falsifying documents and trespassing. And when word of her antics spread through the neighborhood, even the residents who had once supported Karren started distancing themselves. No one wanted to be associated with legal trouble. With both Jeff and Linda effectively neutralized, things finally started to quiet down. The HOA, now desperate to repair its reputation, doubled down on transparency, issuing official statements clarifying that my property was not under their jurisdiction. Homeowners who had once been wary of me now saw the truth: Karren and her supporters had been manipulating them for years. I wasn't looking to be anyone's hero, but I couldn't deny the satisfaction of seeing the neighborhood finally break free from Karren's toxic influence. One afternoon, as I was working in my front yard, a few neighbors approached not to complain but to thank me. They admitted they had been afraid to stand up against Karren in the past, fearing retaliation. Now, with her gone and her supporters exposed, they felt like they could finally breathe. For the first time in years, the neighborhood actually felt like a community again. And as I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sunset without a single worry about HOA nonsense, I knew one thing for certain: Karren had lost, completely and utterly, and I had won. With Linda and Jeff exposed and the HOA scrambling to repair its reputation, I finally allowed myself to believe that things were settling down. The neighborhood finally felt like it was moving forward, and for the first time in years, I wasn't waking up to some new scheme targeting me. That was until I got the letter. It arrived in a plain white envelope, no HOA letterhead this time. That alone made me suspicious. I opened it carefully, unfolding the single sheet of paper inside. The message was short, typed in an overly formal font and infuriatingly vague. A concerned resident was accusing me of being a disruptive presence in the community and suggested that I consider selling my home and leaving for the good of the neighborhood. I exhaled slowly, feeling a familiar irritation creeping in. I had no doubt that one of Karren's few remaining loyalists was behind this, but what caught my attention most was the lack of a signature. Whoever had sent this didn't even have the backbone to put their name on it. That was fine. I had dealt with worse. Rather than let it rattle me, I took the letter straight to Lisa, my attorney. She read it with a look of mild disgust before setting it down on her desk. It wasn't a direct threat, but the intent was clear. Someone wanted me gone. Lisa suggested keeping a record of any further harassment, just in case things escalated. I agreed. If whoever was behind this thought they could intimidate me into leaving the home I had fought so hard to protect, they were going to be sorely disappointed. A week passed uneventfully, then another. I almost started to believe that the letter had been a last, desperate attempt from one of Karren's old allies. But then, the strange incidents started happening. First, my water bill skyrocketed. I checked every pipe, every faucet, but there were no leaks. Then, my internet connection became erratic, dropping out at the worst possible times. I called the utility companies, but they claimed there were no issues on their end. It wasn't until my security cameras picked up movement in my backyard one night that I realized what was happening. The footage was grainy due to the darkness, but the outline of a figure was unmistakable. Someone had entered my property, tampered with my outdoor pipes, and disappeared into the night. I immediately called the police, filing another report. But with no clear identification of the intruder, there wasn't much they could do beyond increasing patrols in the area. That wasn't good enough for me. I upgraded my security system, adding motion-activated floodlights and additional cameras with better night vision. If they came back, I would have a clear picture of exactly who was behind this. 3 nights later, they did. This time, the cameras caught everything. The figure creeping through my yard, fiddling with my water shut-off valve. And when they turned toward the camera, their face was clearly visible. It was Jeff. Even after his failed attempts to harass me, even after the police warning, he was still at it. I wasted no time. I took the footage straight to the police station, filing a new complaint. Tampering with utilities was a serious offense, and with the clear video evidence, they had no choice but to act. Jeff was arrested the next day. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. The same people who had once whispered in support of Karren and her cronies were now openly condemning Jeff's actions. Whatever loyalty had remained for Karren's little circle was crumbling fast. Richard, the HOA president, reached out to me personally, this time not as an adversary, but as someone desperate to distance the HOA from the mess. He assured me that Jeff's actions were not sanctioned by the board and that they were launching their own investigation into any lingering misconduct from Karren's tenure. It didn't matter to me. The damage was done. Jeff, unable to afford the legal battle that followed, ended up selling his home and moving out of the neighborhood. Another one of Karren's inner circle gone. With each defeat, the remnants of her influence continued to fade, and the neighborhood finally seemed to be healing from years of fear and manipulation. As for me, I had won, not just against Karren, but against the entire corrupt system she had built. And I made sure that if anyone ever thought about trying something similar, they knew exactly how it would end. With Jeff gone and the last of Karren's influence crumbling, I expected the neighborhood to finally settle into peace. And for a while, it did. The tension that had once hung over the streets like a storm cloud began to lift. People who had once kept to themselves were now chatting freely at their mailboxes, hosting barbecues, and even organizing small community events. It was a strange but welcome change. The fear that Karren had instilled in everyone was finally dissipating, and without her cronies to enforce her will, the HOA had become little more than a formality. Richard, the new president, had made good on his promise to clean up the mess she left behind. He was handling disputes fairly, listening to homeowner concerns, and most importantly, staying far away from my property. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to watch my back every second of the day. But just when I thought I had put all of this behind me, fate had one last surprise in store. One afternoon, as I was working in my garage, I heard the unmistakable sound of tires screeching to a halt in front of my house. I stepped out, wiping my hands on a rag, only to see a moving truck parked across the street. A small, battered sedan pulled up behind it. The driver's side door swung open, and out stepped a figure I thought I would never see again. Karren. She looked different. Gone was the meticulously styled hair and the designer outfits she used to flaunt. In their place was a woman who had clearly been through the ringer. Her once flawless posture now carried a slight hunch, as if the weight of her own downfall had finally caught up to her. She didn't notice me at first, too busy barking orders at the movers who were unloading furniture onto the driveway. But when she finally turned and spotted me standing there, her entire body stiffened. I expected her to look away, to pretend I didn't exist. But instead, she squared her shoulders and marched right up to my property line. I didn't move. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of resentment and something else I couldn't quite place. Then she spoke. She told me that after selling her house, she had tried to start fresh in another community. But word had spread about what happened here. No HOA wanted to take her in. No neighborhood would tolerate her brand of control. She had burned too many bridges, and now she had nowhere left to go. So she was back. Not by choice, she admitted, but because it was the only place she could afford a rental. She was moving into one of the smaller homes on the far side of the neighborhood, a far cry from the grand house she once lorded over everyone. She didn't apologize, not in any real way. But there was no arrogance in her voice, no condescension, just exhaustion. I didn't say anything. What was there to say? She had done this to herself. As she turned to walk away, she hesitated. For the first time, she looked uncertain. She asked if I was going to make things difficult for her, the way she had once done to me. If I was going to rally the neighborhood against her, make her life unbearable. I could have. I had every reason to, but I didn't. I told her that, unlike her, I had no interest in controlling other people's lives. As long as she stayed out of mine, I wouldn't waste a second thinking about her. That was the last time we ever spoke. Karren faded into the background of the neighborhood, no longer the queen of the HOA, no longer the woman who could make people tremble with a single letter. She was just another resident now, one who had lost everything because she had pushed too hard, too far. The HOA never tried to challenge me again. The new leadership had learned their lesson, and after everything that had happened, they had no desire to stir up old conflicts. For the first time in years, my home was truly mine, and that was victory enough.